So we move on to point 2. And my second point, which again I didn't know because no one had ever told me, and one had to dig deep to find it, was that John Goffman was actually the person who developed the diet, heart, and lipid hypotheses, and his ideas were then stolen by Ancel Keys. So here's John Goffman on the left in the 1960s, when he had become known as the father of clinical lipidology, because he had developed the ultracentrifugation technique, which had allowed him to identify the different lipoproteins in the bloodstream. He got so disillusioned with the field that in the 1970s he moved on and went and looked at the dangers of radiation, particularly X-ray radiation to humans, and became a world authority and won all sorts of awards. So here's a man who had 2 careers, and you have to ask, why would he change his career from getting this award in modern medicine to going into the studies of a completely separate field? And the answer, I believe, was that he was driven out of the field by Ancel Keys, and he realized that the field was going in the wrong direction. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by showing you what his work showed. So remember that Ancel Keys really starts talking about the diet, heart, and lipid hypotheses in 1953. But in 1956, here we have an article of which John Goffman is the first author, titled Evaluation of the Serum Lipoproteins and Cholesterol Measurements as Predictors of Clinical Complications of Atherosclerosis. So he had real data in 1956, long before Keys had even turned his thoughts to how he was going to get these data. And he was the person who gave us these different lipoprotein families. And just to remind you of the different lipoproteins and their constituents, I just want to remind you that the VLDL has made a large contribution from triglycerides, whereas LDL has a major contribution from cholesterol. And it's really important because what we're going to show is that Goffman realized very early on that LDL was increased somewhat in people eating higher fat diets, but he also recognized at the same time that triglycerides in the VLDL lipoproteins was increased by carbohydrates. And he gave equal measure, in my reading, to both of those as potential causes of coronary heart disease. And it was Keys who wrote out the carbohydrate story, as I'll show you. And ultimately, on July the 1st, 1965, the carbohydrate story was completely lost, as they were whitewashed and health washed by some Harvard professors who were bribed to do it, but we'll get to that. In the meantime, we need to remember that Keys and Goffman differed in that Keys did not consider that carbohydrates contributed anything to heart disease. So here's a diagram of what Goffman was measuring. Goffman was measuring the flotation rates of the different lipoproteins. And you can see on the top are the specific lipoproteins, VLDL. So that's wrong. It should be, it's very low density lipoproteins. The intermediate density lipoproteins, low density lipoproteins, and high density lipoproteins. And the flotation numbers, which was what he worked on, he differentiated a group that were from 0 to 20 and from 20 to 400. And this is the size of the different lipoproteins. And in blue is their concentration in the bloodstream. So you'll see that the LDL is the most prevalent lipoprotein. So he focused on the 0 to 20 and the 20 to 400 flotation rates. And he showed early on that the 0 to 20, which is the LDL and the IDL, is increased by dietary fats, whereas the 20 to 400 is increased by dietary carbohydrate. and that's critical, as I'll show you. So here's a paper in 1950, long before Keyes has ever considered the diet-heart hypothesis, and this is the information that the article includes. Individuals of both genders with myocardial infarction displayed a very high frequency of occurrence of the SF10 to 20 molecules in the serum, and that is LDL cholesterol, as I showed you. And the presence of these molecules supports the hypothesis of their association with atherosclerosis, and that is the lipid hypothesis described in August 1950 by Dr. Goffman. A group of patients prescribed a strict low-fat and low-cholesterol diet for periods of 3 months to 3 years had lower concentrations of the LDL class than either normal or other myocardial infarction patients, and that is the diet-heart hypothesis. So there they are, described in 1950. So by 1950, Goffman had already formulated the diet-heart and lipid hypotheses, and Ancel Keyes was nowhere to be seen. Goffman in 1954 published an article saying that he had worked out something called the atherogenic index, and that was based on the flotation rates and the concentrations of the different lipoproteins in people with heart attacks. And he said, according to his units, if you had more AI units, then your risk of heart disease was increased. And he even showed that in male coronary artery disease patients on the right, there was the A1 values were shifted to the right. So you can see the mean values at about 100 compared to about 70 in patients who did not have coronary artery disease. So that again is the lipid hypothesis, showing that he measured something in blood that he linked. It was a lipoprotein pattern that he linked to increased rates of coronary heart disease. He wrote 2 books. This was one of them. The other one was What Do We Know About Heart Attacks? These books were written for the general public, and I couldn't get the copy of the cover of the 1960 article, so I've used the one that I do have on the left. And this is what he wrote in the book on the second book I mentioned. In many individuals, the risk of coronary heart disease comes primarily from the SF20 to 400 lipoproteins. For such individuals, any attempt to lower heart attack risk by shifting from animal fat to vegetable fat would be illogical. For such individuals, the preventive efforts would have to be directed towards lowering the carbohydrate intake, which will on the average reduce the SF20 to 400 lipoprotein levels. And remember, the 20 to 400 lipoproteins are the VLDL triglyceride-rich concentration. So he understood that the lipoproteins, the triglyceride-rich VLDL, is influenced by the carbohydrate content of the diet. And he was the first to appreciate that. There were many others who subsequently realized it, but he was one of the first. So here's another publication of his diet in the prevention and treatment of myocardial infarction, published in the American Journal of Cardiology, 1957. And in this article, he took a single patient who'd had a heart attack, a myocardial infarction survivor, and on the patient's usual diet, which was not low carbohydrate, the patient had increased concentration of triglycerides, the SF20 to 400 lipoproteins, but the concentration of cholesterol was according to the black columns. The patient then went on a low carbohydrate, 100-gram carbohydrate daily diet, and you'll notice that triglycerides rapidly fell and stayed low for the duration that the person ate 100 grams of carbohydrate daily. Cholesterol values did not change. Despite this, the atherogenic index, notice, fell as well. That's in blue. So according to Goffman, this patient had benefited even though his cholesterol had not reduced. His cholesterol had stayed the same. His triglycerides had fallen. And so he said a massive fall in the serum SF20 to 400 lipoprotein levels occurs on the low carbohydrate diet without significant changes in the LDL levels. Accompanying this fall in lipoproteins is a highly marked and favorable reduction in the atherogenic index value. So what Goffman is saying here is that changing to a low carbohydrate diet was very beneficial for this patient and should have reduced the patient's risk of future heart attack. And he concluded ultimately a statement that got hidden. Neglect of the carbohydrate factor can lead to serious consequences, first in the failure to correct the diet in some individuals who are very sensitive to the carbohydrate action, and second, by allowing certain individuals sensitive to the carbohydrate action to take too much carbohydrate as a replacement for some of their animal fats. His work then was confirmed by Peter Q. from Philadelphia, and here's a paper he wrote in 1967. And Peter Q. ran a clinic for lipid abnormalities to which patients were referred by cardiologists who wanted a dietary management for their patients. And what he discovered was that the patients were sent to him because they had high cholesterol levels. And he was able to differentiate between those who had essential familial hypercholesterolemia, who were the minority, only 8%, from those who had hypertriglyceridemia as the primary problem, associated in some with hypercholesterolemia and others with not with hypercholesterolemia. So here you see 28 patients, or 9%, had high triglycerides but a normal cholesterol, but the majority of patients had a high cholesterol and high triglycerides. So here we move on, and he says, although the majority of patients with atherosclerosis in this series were referred to us for the investigation of hypercholesterolemia, only 8.4% were found to have essential familial hypercholesterolemia. More than 90% were found to have carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia with or without hypercholesterolemia. Thus, it's reasonable to assume that with proper dietary preparation and appropriate laboratory studies, a high incidence of carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia could be demonstrated in persons with atherosclerosis. And so this is one of the first studies to suggest that. He then showed that if you took patients with carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia and put them on a low-carbohydrate diet, you notice that their triglyceride levels fell dramatically, whereas the cholesterol levels also fell, quite surprisingly. He then took 64 patients over 16 months and confirmed that if you had carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia, your triglyceride levels could normalize during that period, and cholesterol levels also dropped a little bit. So he concluded that since patients with carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia suffer primarily from disorders involving exaggerated biosynthesis of triglyceride-rich lipoproteins from carbohydrates, carbohydrate restriction should constitute a feasible form of treatment. For practical purposes, it's necessary to eliminate all dietary sugars, sucrose, fructose, and lactose, on account of their high lipemic insulin-stimulating effects and low satiety value as compared with starches, or to lower carbohydrate consumption to about 500 calories per day, which is about 120 grams of carbohydrate. He also found that the sensitivity to simple carbohydrate is widespread among both healthy and atherosclerotic populations. In persons on an ad libitum American diet, lipogenic activities from simple carbohydrates appear to vary from low levels in young girls to very marked degrees in patients with atherosclerosis who are sensitive to carbohydrates, with apparently healthy men somewhere in between. So he's recognizing insulin resistance as a driver of hypertriglyceridemia and showing that with age it gets worse, and also a gender effect. So he concludes that the role of this variable cellular response to carbohydrates in human atherosclerosis, as reflected by a rise of very low density lipoproteins and serum triglyceride levels, deserves further and more intensive investigation. And this never happened, and I'll show you why. Because on November 1967, the New England Journal of Medicine published a paper from three Harvard professors saying that carbohydrates were healthy in heart disease and fats were unhealthy. And we'll get to that. But this was the end of the debate. So Q and Goffman and others had raised the question that carbohydrates are causing heart disease, and there was plenty of evidence for it, but Keyes had driven the high fat story, and this article was forgotten when the Harvard professors said that sugar and carbohydrates were safe. So this never happened, and instead the focus shifted to cholesterol and the role of dietary fat in the causation of coronary atherosclerosis. And that is the further story that I'll be picking up in the second half of this lecture.